The story of how the Nazi Party came to dominate Germany begins in the ashes of another conflict. In 1918, World War I finally came to an end. Germany was defeated. The German Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was gone, having fled the country. In his place, a new government was formed, known as the Weimar Republic. This was a completely new way of doing things for Germany. It was a democracy, where people could vote for their leaders. But this new republic was born into a world of trouble. The war had cost Germany dearly, not just in money, but in lives. Millions of German soldiers had been killed or wounded, and the nation was in a state of shock and grief. The peace that followed the war felt more like a punishment to many Germans. The victorious countries came together to decide Germany's fate. Britain, France, the United States. They created the Treaty of Versailles. This treaty placed all the blame for the war squarely on Germany. It forced the nation to give up large areas of its land, which were rich in industry and resources. The German army was also dramatically shrunk, its navy was taken away, and it was forbidden from having an air force. This was a deep humiliation for a country that had once prided itself on its military strength and its status as a great European power. Perhaps the most crushing blow of the treaty was the demand for reparations. These were massive payments Germany was ordered to make to the Allied countries to pay for the damage the war had caused. The amount was enormous, far more than Germany could realistically afford to pay. This financial burden would hang over the new German government like a dark cloud for years to come. Many Germans felt that the treaty was fundamentally unfair. They called it the Diktat, a dictated peace forced upon them without any real negotiation. This widespread feeling of injustice created a deep well of resentment that would poison German politics for the next decade. This sense of betrayal was a powerful and dangerous emotion. A popular myth began to spread, known as the stab-in-the-back legend. This idea claimed that the German army had not actually been defeated on the battlefield. Instead, it had been betrayed by politicians, communists, Jewish people back home. This was completely untrue. The German army was on the verge of total collapse by late 1918. But the myth was easier for many to believe than the painful truth of military defeat. It provided simple scapegoats for a complex disaster and allowed people to direct their anger at specific groups within their own society, laying a dangerous foundation for what was to come. The new Weimar Republic faced an almost impossible task from its very beginning. It was blamed for signing the hated Treaty of Versailles, making it unpopular with many Germans from day one. The political situation was incredibly unstable. The government was a democracy. Many different parties competed for power. No single party was strong enough to rule alone. They had to form coalitions. Those coalitions were weak and often fell apart. Governments rose and fell constantly, creating a sense of chaos and weak leadership when the country needed strength. On the streets, this political chaos spilled into violence. Extreme groups from left and right refused to accept the republic. On one side, communists. They wanted a revolution like Russia's. On the other side, extreme nationalists. Royalists. Both wanted a return to old authoritarian rule. Both sides had private armies, paramilitaries, clashing in the streets. Cities became battlegrounds. Ordinary people felt unsafe and anxious. Then came hyperinflation in 1923. To pay reparations, the government printed huge amounts of money. The currency became worthless. Prices for everyday goods like bread and milk skyrocketed, sometimes hour by hour. Life savings were wiped out overnight. A wheelbarrow of banknotes could buy a loaf of bread. The middle class lost trust in the government. Fear of economic collapse lingered, making people desperate for a promise of order. In the mid-1920s, things briefly improved. American loans helped the economy recover. Street violence receded and Berlin's cultural scene blossomed. This was the golden 20s. But that stability was fragile, built on borrowed money and fragile optimism. The underlying problems, resentment over the treaty, political divisions, fear of economic collapse, had not disappeared. They were hiding beneath the surface, waiting for a new crisis to roar them back. Everything changed in October 1929. The stock market on Wall Street in New York City crashed, triggering a worldwide economic disaster known as the Great Depression. The American banks that had been lending money to Germany suddenly demanded their loans back. Without these loans, the German economy, which had been built on this fragile foundation, collapsed almost overnight. Businesses went bankrupt. Factories closed their doors. Millions of people lost their jobs. By 1932, 1 in 3 German workers was unemployed. People were hungry. People were desperate. People were terrified for their future. This economic catastrophe shattered the German people's faith in the Weimar government. The political center ground collapsed as voters, driven by fear and anger, began to look for radical solutions. They turned to the extreme left. They turned to the extreme right, who promised decisive action and a complete change from the current system. Amidst the chaos of post-war Germany, a small, seemingly insignificant political group formed in Munich in 1919. It was originally called the German Workers' Party. Disgruntled ex-soldiers, nationalists, people angry about the Treaty of Versailles, people angry about the direction Germany was headed. They met in beer halls, sharing frustrations and dreaming of a different future. One of many small radical groups at the time, very few members, almost no public profile. Nobody could have predicted what they would become. Into this small group walked a man named Adolf Hitler, Austrian-born, a former German soldier in WWI. The German defeat left him bitter and directionless. Sent by the army to spy, he agreed with many ideas, drawn to extreme nationalism, drawn to hatred of the Treaty of Versailles, drawn to anti-Semitic beliefs blaming Jewish people. Hitler soon joined the party. He had a special talent the group desperately needed. Hitler was a mesmerizing public speaker. Other members were uninspiring in contrast. He could hold an audience captive with passion and force. He simplified fears into powerful emotional speeches. He named clear enemies. Politicians who signed the treaty, the communists, the Jews. He promised to tear up the treaty, restore Germany's strength, create a unified, powerful nation. His charisma made him the central figure. By 1921, Hitler became the undisputed leader. He renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. He introduced the swastika, white circle on red background. Under Hitler, the party began to grow, still small and regional in Bavaria, becoming more organized, more confident, more determined to seize power. Using Hitler's voice as its most powerful weapon, the Nazi Party understood better than any other political group the power of image and emotion. They didn't just try to win arguments with facts and figures, they aimed to win the hearts and minds of the German people through a carefully crafted campaign of propaganda. This was masterminded by Joseph Goebbels, who became the party's propaganda chief. The Nazis used every tool available to them to spread their message. They printed millions of posters, pamphlets, newspapers filled with simple slogans and striking images. These materials were designed to be easily understood and to stir up strong feelings of anger, fear, and hope. Central to their strategy were the mass rallies. These were spectacular theatrical events. Thousands of uniformed party members marched with torches and banners under the night sky. There was music, flags, and a powerful sense of unity and belonging. The highlight was always a speech by Adolf Hitler. He would arrive late to build anticipation, then deliver a fiery speech, his voice rising from a low growl to a passionate shout. For people who felt lost and powerless, these rallies offered excitement, strength, and purpose. By 1923, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party were growing impatient. Based in the southern German state of Bavaria, they felt strong enough to make a bold move. Inspired by Benito Mussolini's March on Rome in Italy, which had successfully brought him to power, Hitler planned to seize control of the government in Munich, and then march on the capital, Berlin. On the evening of November 8, 1923, Hitler and his stormtroopers burst into a large beer hall, the Bürgerbraukeller, where Bavarian government leaders were holding a meeting. Firing a pistol into the ceiling, Hitler declared that a national revolution had begun. At first it seemed to be working. With the help of the famous World War I general, Erich Ludendorff, Hitler forced the Bavarian leaders to support his planned takeover. However, their support was not genuine. Overnight, the authorities organized resistance against the Putsch. The next day, Hitler and around 2,000 of his supporters marched through the center of Munich. They were met by police and soldiers. Shots were fired, and in the brief gunfight that followed, 16 Nazis, 4 police officers were killed. The Putsch collapsed in failure. Hitler fled but was captured 2 days later. Hitler was put on trial for treason, a crime that could carry a life sentence, but the trial turned into a major publicity victory for him. The judges were sympathetic to his nationalist views, and they allowed him to use the courtroom as a stage. He gave long, passionate speeches, claiming that he was not a traitor but a German patriot who was only trying to save his country. Newspapers across Germany reported on the trial, and for the first time Adolf Hitler became a nationally known figure. Instead of a long prison sentence, he was given the minimum of 5 years and was sent to the comfortable Landsberg prison. Hitler ended up serving less than a year in prison, but his time there was transformative. He realized that trying to seize power through force and violence had been a mistake. The state was still too strong. He decided that the Nazis must change their strategy. Instead of trying to overthrow the Weimar Republic, they would have to destroy it from within. They would use the tools of democracy, elections, parliament, to gain power legally. While in prison, he wrote his book Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, which laid out his hateful ideology and his new plan. The failed putsch taught him a valuable lesson. The path to power was not through revolution, but through the ballot box. After Hitler's release from prison, the Nazi Party struggled for several years. The mid-1920s were the golden 20s for Germany. Economy was recovering, politics were more stable, people were generally more optimistic. In this climate of relative prosperity, the radical and angry message of the Nazis found little support. In the 1928 national elections, the Nazi Party performed very poorly, winning only about 2.6% of the vote. They were still a fringe party seen by most as loud but irrelevant extremists. It seemed their moment had passed, and that the Weimar Republic had finally found its footing. Everything changed in October 1929. The stock market on Wall Street in New York City crashed, triggering a worldwide economic disaster known as the Great Depression. The American banks that had been lending money to Germany suddenly demanded their loans back. Without these loans, the German economy, which had been built on this fragile foundation, collapsed almost overnight. Businesses went bankrupt, factories closed their doors, millions of people lost their jobs. By 1932, 1 in 3 German workers was unemployed. People were hungry. People were desperate. People were terrified for their future. This economic catastrophe shattered the German people's faith in the Weimar government. The moderate political parties seemed helpless to solve the crisis. The political center ground collapsed as voters, driven by fear and anger, began to look for radical solutions. They turned to the extreme left. They turned to the extreme right, who promised decisive action and a complete change from the current system. The communists gained support, but the biggest winner by far was the Nazi Party. For Adolf Hitler, the Great Depression was a political gift. His predictions of disaster had come true, and his simple, powerful message suddenly resonated with millions of desperate Germans. He promised to restore order, put people back to work, make Germany strong again. He blamed Germany's suffering on the Treaty of Versailles, the weak democratic government, the Jewish people. In the 1930 election, the Nazi Party's support exploded. They went from having just 12 seats in the German parliament, the Reichstag, to having 107. They were no longer a fringe group. They were now the second largest party in the country, and their rise seemed unstoppable. With their newfound electoral success, the Nazis became a major force in German politics that could no longer be ignored. The political system of the Weimar Republic began to break down completely. Because no party could win a majority of seats in the Reichstag, it became impossible to form a stable government. The country was increasingly ruled by emergency decrees issued by the elderly president, Paul von Hindenburg, a former World War I field marshal. He was a conservative figure who distrusted democracy and longed for the old days of authoritarian rule. He and his small circle of conservative advisors held the real power. Hitler, meanwhile, continued his relentless campaign. In 1932, he ran for president against the popular Hindenburg. Although Hitler lost the election, he won a massive 37% of the vote, proving his immense popularity across the country. The Nazi Party's momentum continued to build. In the Reichstag election of July 1932, the Nazis achieved their greatest electoral success yet. They won 230 seats, making them by far the largest party in the German parliament. They did not have a majority, but their position was so dominant that it was nearly impossible to form any government without them. Despite their electoral strength, Hitler was not yet in power. President Hindenburg personally disliked Hitler, viewing him as a vulgar and noisy rabble-rouser. He repeatedly refused to appoint Hitler as chancellor, the head of the government. However, the political chaos continued. The conservative elites who surrounded Hindenburg, led by figures like the former Chancellor Franz von Papen, were running out of options. They were unable to govern effectively and were terrified that the growing unrest could lead to a communist revolution. It was these conservative politicians who made the fatal miscalculation. They came up with what they thought was a clever plan. They believed they could control Hitler. They would make him chancellor, but they would surround him with their own conservative ministers in the cabinet. They thought they could use Hitler's popular support to achieve their own goals of destroying democracy crushing the left, and then cast him aside. Von Papen famously reassured a concerned colleague, "We have hired him." They persuaded the reluctant President Hindenburg that this was the only way to achieve a stable government and avoid civil war. On January 30, 1933, the conservative elite's plan was put into action. President Paul von Hindenburg formally appointed Adolf Hitler as the Chancellor of Germany. From the outside it looked like a normal transfer of power in a democracy.